Hello, welcome. I hope you enjoyed the first session. We will continue now with session 2 that will focus on audiovisual services and what will be the impact of geo-blocking prohibition, a potential geo-blocking prohibition. Let me present the speakers. We'll start with presentation by the senior fellow here at Bruegel, Scott Marcus. And then we will continue with panel discussion. We have Agustin Reina, who will also join us in the second panel. We have Gareth Sear from Oxera that he will present also some slides. And we have also Werner Steng. Werner is in a meeting that is running late, so he will join us shortly. I think it's better to start, and I will give the floor to Scott for the presentation.
Thank you. My mic is live, I think. Everyone can hear me? Good. Okay, and the slides are up. Well, good. Well, I'm going to be talking about geo-blocking of audiovisual services, which is, of course, the thrust of this full panel. So this is what I'm going to be covering. A quick word about the geo-blocking regulation as it relates to, or doesn't relate to, audiovisual services. Geo-blocking of copyrighted content in general, why we view it as an issue, as a problem. What the potential demand might be for cross-border access to audiovisual content. Possible risks of a rule regarding audiovisual content. And also some questions as to whether a more limited prohibition might make sense. For this, the material I'll be presenting is almost entirely based on a study that Yorgos and I had the honor of doing together for the IMCO committee of the European Parliament. Some of you will have already had the chance to look at the study. That's the base for the work. So again, as we, I think, all know in this room, the European Commission, introduced a legislative proposal that dealt with geo-blocking in general. There were many important exclusions from it. The Commission's initial proposal had totally excluded copyrighted services that related primarily to the delivery of copyrighted content, including audiovisual content. Also, interestingly enough, excluded any goods that required shipment. That's an interesting area. I've got a separate paper out on that in case anyone's interested, but it's not the topic for the day. So let's move along. There we go. And talk about the problem. And the first point about the problem with geo-blocking is that there are many different kinds of geo-blocking, and they come at many different points in the acquisition process. A mystery shopper study that was done for the Commission found that in total about 2/3 of requests for cross-border delivery failed one way or another. Some of them were rejected outright by the website. Some of them were not permitted to go through the website. Some of them, even if the items otherwise might have been purchased, it wasn't possible to arrange for shipping. And the last category is that in some cases, after you'd done all of that, it was impossible to pay for it. And of course, in each case, this means aggravation for some poor consumer who wanted to place an order and got blocked, in some cases, pretty far into the process. So, this is why it's been an issue, one of many reasons. Now, the demand for copyrighted content is growing, and especially digital content. Increasingly, the content is digital. Increasingly, it's delivered online. The number of individuals who ordered content delivered or upgraded online grew by 45%, nearly by half again, between 2011 and 2014. And yet we find that blocking for copyrighted content is quite common, 70% roughly. It depends a little on exactly which number you read and from when, but it's in that range. It's visible in the sector inquiry and in other places, and it's a big number. There's an awful lot of blocking that goes on. I might also add, why do people want it? Normally they want cross-border acquisition because they can't get the content that they want in their own country. So all of these are issues. There are reasons why it's a concern, but then the question becomes what to do about it. Now, we see that copyrighted content is delivered digitally, more for some kinds than for others, games and music a lot. Less so here for films, but that's partly also, this is a 2016 report, and of course Netflix is gaining in salience all the time, so this is probably a figure that's moving quickly. From the sector inquiry, there were many responses from content providers, also from rights holders. These are from the content providers, and what we see is that a good 57% of the contracts that were submitted by the content providers demonstrated that they were limited to a single member state. A substantial additional fraction, like about a quarter, were limited to 2 to 4 member states. So again, it's a common practice. What the right-hand graph shows is that it's more common for certain kinds of digital content than for others. More common for children's TV and fiction TV than it is for nonfiction or for music. So somewhat different patterns. If you look at it from the rights holders' side, the contracts they submitted, for whatever reason, seem to show less blocking. Perhaps they were trying to show less blocking, one does not know. But still substantial geo-blocking taking place. I don't think that there's a question that substantial geo-blocking takes place. And here again were the proportion where the agreements required the content providers to geo-block by category, and we see that for fictional TV and for films, it's much higher than for some other kinds of content, but it's substantial for many different kinds of digital content. 74% for fictional TV, 66% for films. So it is an issue. Now, this needs to be put a bit in perspective. I'll point out that what we're talking about today primarily is geo-blocking, and presumably it primarily measures that relate to retail sales to consumers. There have also been concerns at the, call it the wholesale level, really the agreements between rights holders and broadcasters with geo-blocking. And there was an important set of undertakings submitted by Paramount in connection with their arrangements with Sky. They had been restricting those agreements. The Commission required them to do something. The undertaking said that they won't require blocking anymore and won't enter into new contracts that require blocking. So that's a resolved matter. It's a different case, but it's a related case. Again, that's at the wholesale arrangements between the companies. Most of our discussion today is in regard to geo-blocking arrangements at the retail level to consumers. So in the study that we did for the Parliament, one of the things that we were looking at was trying to estimate what the unfulfilled demand might be for different kinds of copyrighted services. And I don't see Fran here now, but she would have been happy to hear that, what she already knows perfectly well, which is we analyzed e-publishing separately from music and separately from audiovisual, because each of them has different characteristics, not only in the potential audience, but also in terms of the likelihood that consumers would purchase services cross-border, and also their willingness to pay for services cross-border. So here again, why do consumers want to access cross-border? Looking for content that's not available in their country, wider choice. In some cases, a particular interest is one that's a little lower in the chart here, because they come from a different country, a different member state. That may be a smaller number of consumers, but it may be consumers who are highly motivated to acquire. So it's an important group for its own reasons. So what did we do for the Parliament? Well, in the study, we took an approach where we started with an estimate of the number of households in a particular category where they might have some reason to want cross-border access. It's the residual, the everybody else category, was those who don't have a special reason, but may still have some interest in purchasing cross-border content. Then within that, estimating willingness to pay, estimating the fraction that would be willing to make such an acquisition, basically multiplying the probability by the number of households involved, by the willingness to pay, to get an approximate estimate of what the willingness to pay is. But that's still willingness to pay, that's not actual purchases. And also, we needed to make some corrections because, of course, some of these services already are acquired cross-border. So that's what we did. I have to say it was a somewhat crude analysis, just as Professor Martins was saying in the first session. A lot of these are things where one really wishes one had more data than is in fact available. In a few cases, we had real data. Wherever we could find data, we used it, but there were cases where we didn't find real data. That's just the way the world works. So what were the categories we were looking at? Well, first was people who are away from their country of origin. Long-term migrants within the European Union, short-term migrants, travelers. This is more like a roaming issue. Others who have a special interest in foreign language. Either they have proficiency or they're studying a foreign language or they're able to follow news in English or some other language. Linguistic minorities exist in many of the member states as well. So each of those are groups that may have a particular affinity to cross-border content. We came up with estimates of the number of those groups. That's based on some honest-to-gosh data in almost all cases. But the other things get a little harder. Now, among those who are away from country of origin, language skills clearly play a big deal, but language plays a different role depending on the kind of digital media that we're talking about. And recall, we were looking separately at each kind of copyrighted media. So for music, language plays a much smaller role. You can appreciate music. Some of it doesn't have words anyway, and even if it does, you can appreciate a song even if you don't understand the words. When it comes to reading a book, you probably really need to know the language. And of course, when we talk about audiovisual content, a fraction of audiovisual content is designed for consumption by those who speak other languages, and so it might be dubbed, there might be voiceover, or there might be subtitling. So that's media that obviously can be appreciated on a cross-border basis, even by those who don't speak the language. Now, in terms of willingness to pay, there actually is a study done by Plum Consulting in 2012 where they had a series of questionnaires and they provided some estimates about willingness to pay and the fraction that would be willing to pay it. And this is one of the graphs from that study. And so there we were able to come up with some honest-to-gosh founded estimates on what the incremental willingness to pay would be. I would say that even so, you know, one always has questions as to how good a questionnaire is on revealing true willingness to pay, but at least something to hang one's hat on. We also tried looking at, for example, the degree to which content is already delivered in a multilingual basis among existing television channels. We took a few shots at subtracting out the degree to which the demand for cross-border service is already met. Again, I really have to say, all of this is done somewhat imperfectly, but the best one could do with the data that's around. Putting all the numbers together, we came up with a most likely estimate of a bit less than 400 million per annum in unsatisfied willingness to pay for audiovisual content, with an upper bound around $1 billion and a lower bound around 200 million. Now, these, you could say they sound like big numbers, but in fact, they're not very big numbers at all. These are really pretty small numbers. In any case, it represents an estimate of incremental willingness to pay. That's not necessarily exactly the fraction that would be sold. Relates obviously to business plans, and also in some cases it's not practical to sell some of these. The content would be delivered digitally. Not everyone has a broadband connection that would be suitable for delivering it. So, but at least it sets an order of magnitude, perhaps the first order of magnitude on what the demand might be. Now, having said that, one has to talk about possible risks. And here, there's some real possible risks. You have to understand that the audiovisual sector is segmented, or rather that the distribution of works is segmented both on a geographic basis by member state, but also in the time dimension through release windows. This actually comes from a study that was done by Oxera, and one of the authors is sitting to my right, your left. And so basically what they nicely document is the release windows in different countries. And here you can see from, it doesn't really show on the screen. No, I would have liked to gesture here. These are the theatrical windows, home entertainment, pay TV, and free-to-air. And among these, basically the majority of the revenue comes during the theatrical window. So it comes relatively early in the cycle. But the segmenting in the time enables the rights holders basically to extract more revenue, and it's part of the funding model. So the concern that's been raised by the industry is if you muck about too much with the geographic and time windowing arrangements, you risk undermining the funding model by which the audiovisual works are produced in the first place. And it's a concern that shows up in multiple studies. Some studies that were funded by the industry, at least one that comes up with substantially identical results that was funded by the Commission. So I think these claims all have to be taken seriously. The basic line of reasoning, which is, I think, clearly articulated in the Axera study, the one that you'll be hearing from shortly, is that the creation of the audiovisual works is expensive, profitability is unpredictable in advance. It's an experience good. You don't really know in advance which ones will be hits and which ones will be bombs. And that pre-financing plays a large role in getting the works funded. And the territoriality and time windowing are crucial in the predictability of that funding. So this is the argument that's made, and as I said, it's persuasive in my judgment. Again, from the Axera study, you'll see these are 5 independent films, and what you can see, the dark blue line is pre-sales revenues, so it's a substantial fraction of the total. Again, I think it's a claim that has to be taken seriously. Now, actually, in fact, here we go. Here's a quote at the bottom from the study I was mentioning for the Commission by Charles River Associates. And what they find is substantially the same as in the Axera study. So it's a valid concern. Now, at the same time, consistent with everything that we heard in the last panel, the single market argument about why you would like all of this to work and why you would like all of the audiovisual productions to be available everywhere is also clear. You know, there's good reasons to want cross-border availability. The questions have much more to do with how to get there and how to get there without unacceptable levels of disruption. Now, with all of that said, the concern expressed through the studies was over the total volume of audiovisual production. But I don't think anybody has a particular magic number on what the optimal level of audiovisual production is in Europe. One should bear in mind that a relatively small fraction of European audiovisual work is targeted for multi-country distribution. I talked before about dubbing and such, but in fact that's the minority. In various years, the numbers range in the teens. 12% shows up in one of the Commission documents. The challenges about content being designed for single language groups or single countries is not a question so much of the volume of content that's produced, it's rather how it's designed, how it's planned for in the first place. Hollywood plans for international distribution right at the point where the works are first intended. So all works, or let's say a very large fraction of works, are designed with global distribution in mind from the first. In Europe, it's clearly not the case. As a result, what we have in Europe is, in an average year, about 2.5 times as many feature films created as in Hollywood, and yet they achieve only about 25% of European box office revenue. The Yanks outperform us by a factor of 2 to 1 with only half as many films, which means that they're getting more than 4 times as much revenue per film. So one could argue, and this is a somewhat provocative statement, but one could argue that we produce too many films without a good enough marketing plan. Right? It's a provocative statement, but I think it's not a crazy statement. And one could even argue that national subsidy arrangements, which tend to subsidize single country films, perhaps exacerbate the problem. Now, that's a purely economic interpretation. I mean, I don't want to oversimplify it because this is a complicated area. Films aren't just about money. They're also about diversity, they're about cultural pluralism, and they're also an art form. So again, and many other aspects as well. So it's not just about money. But one could make the argument, as I said, that there's nothing holy about the current level of production. Still, I think it's fairly clear, if one had concerns about the structure of the sector in Europe, and frankly I do, trying to deal with it solely through geo blocking would be a wrong thing to do. It's too blunt an instrument. You would need a much more orchestrated and comprehensive approach to how the sector works. Okay, So what could actually be considered as alternatives to the current geo-blocking provision, to a broad geo-blocking prohibition for audiovisual content? Are there more modest forms that might have some prospect of working, either in this cycle or in a future legislative cycle? And there's two things that could be thought about. Here we come back to the windowing arrangement. If one thought about a geo-blocking prohibition that would cut in not at day one, not at the day of first theatrical release, but rather substantially later, at that point, a lot of the revenue has been extracted. A high fraction for some films is already extracted during the first 100 to 200 days, during the theatrical window. Certainly, if one held off to the free-to-air window, at that point there's relatively little money still up for grabs. And at that point, one could easily imagine that a geo-blocking provision that cut in that late in the game would have minimal impact or low impact. I'd be interested actually in feedback from the audience on this. Would have much less impact on the predictability of revenues and on the pre-financing than a broad prohibition would have. Another area that could be looked at is almost all the work to date has focused on subscription video on demand. Transactional video on demand, where you order individual works, is probably much more interesting for most people anyway and would tend to have less of an impact. Many of those things are available as well, DVDs are going down, but still, many of them are available earlier in the windowing cycle anyway. So suffice to say, one could think about limited prohibitions that might at some point make sense. I don't think much analysis has been done on these at all. This was not, by the way, it was only very lightly touched on in the work for the Parliament. So with that said, to wrap up, there are good reasons to want a prohibition on geo-blocking of audiovisual content, but there's substantial risk of harming business models in the sector, and I take those risks seriously. Evolution of business models, probably needed, I think. The idea that the current model is optimal seems unlikely to me, but that would require a comprehensive solution, not just a point solution like this. And finally, a targeted approach that took a more modest approach toward a geo-blocking prohibition is something that could be considered. And with that, I'm happy to hand over to the next.
Thank you very much, Scott, for this presentation, and let's welcome Werner to our company. Let's go to the panel discussion. I would like to ask you in general 3 questions. Your comment, and that applies to all the panelists. We'll start with Gareth, who will present also the Oxera study that already mentioned in Scott's presentation. So the first is, if indeed you think that this provocative argument has some basis that in Europe we produce so many films. And I would like also to hear your thoughts on the 2 potential solutions that are related to the limited prohibition, like this time window after which geo-blocking should be prohibited, or the transactional video on demand case. So, Gareth, the floor is yours.
Lovely. Maybe I'll start with going through the slides that I've got, because I think we'll certainly cover the first question as we go through, and then I'll address the 2 suggestions when we get to the end there. So I'm Gareth Shire. I'm a senior consultant at Oxera, an economics consultancy that prepared a report for the MPAA looking at the impact that cross-border access to AV content would have. It's worth touching on the background to that report. It wasn't specific on geo-blocking and the proposal that's here. It was commissioned before that was released at the time of the original DSM announcements, which were calling for a comprehensive making available of cross-border content. So that's what we focus on. It's also worth having in mind that the Oxera report is very consumer-focused. Throughout the report, the question we've been asking ourselves is, what's the impact on European consumers, European film consumers and TV consumers as the effects of cross-border AV access take hold and as the industry develops around those. To the extent that we do have differences in the outcomes that we find from Scott's study and from the other studies you cited, it's more around the scope and the duration of the assessment that we make. We look a bit beyond the instant impact and what consumers would do as soon as cross-border was available, and start to think, how would that industry evolve? What would we likely see in the long run as producers and distributors evolve within that? Before I do look at the results that Auxera found there, it's probably worth recapping a little bit about what makes AV different. So we know that it's been pulled out of the Geo Blocking study, the Geo Blocking proposal as it stands at the moment. Why is that? Now, to pick up on a theme from this morning, for me it circulates around the industry characteristics and how they lean towards making price differentiation a welfare-enhancing feature of offers in this case. So it's pretty uncontroversial that films are high sunk fixed costs. It costs a lot of money to make a movie, and you can't make half a movie and test it. You're in for a penny, in for a pound. The reproduction cost is low. Once that work is out there, it's incredibly cheap. With the advent of digital sharing, it's incredibly cheap for me to be able to share that film, and when I do, it doesn't prevent me from viewing it. Diverse and fragmented demand. Now, this is where I have a slightly more sympathetic response to the film production numbers that maybe Scott showed. Europe is producing a lot of film, but it's got a very diverse and fragmented demand base. Even Hollywood films, even a film which people may think of as very heterogeneous, very homogeneous, is found to have very different performance measures across different European countries. I had a quick look at box office takings for some hits a few years ago as part of the work I was doing on the pay TV case, and you find that a film that's ranked in the top 10 in the UK or Germany doesn't make the rankings in Spain or Italy, or is down 20, 30. You know, these big films do not attract the same audience, and this is cultural. This is due to the cultural significance of those films, what's gone before, as well as language, of course. Films are characterized by this limited prime commercial shelf life. We saw the window, we saw the long tail. There is a period where, from first release in that country, the saliency of a film drops off as it gets older. And of course, we do have a significant risk of failure. Every work is an individual innovation. It's an individual work that has to stand on its own 2 feet. So these are things that lend themselves, from Economics 101, to being good products for price differentiation to increase welfare overall. We'll touch on some of the mechanisms that give rise to that. In response to these features, the industry has come to rely on several key mechanisms, windowing being one, and that's both an intertemporal windowing and also the distribution channel windowing. So you typically see the highest value channels, theatre, a very immersive experience, coming early in the windowing, and then getting progressively lower value and as you go on. Territorial licensing, again, a key part of this, and we'll dig into that a bit more in the next slide, and content exclusivity. Content exclusivity is key. With the window and the territorial licensing addressing the differing consumer preferences, your cultural diversity, your time and format preferences, your ability and willingness to pay, content exclusivity allows platforms to differentiate themselves. Remember, there's a layer in the market between producers and consumers which need to find this content attractive as well. And if I want to differentiate my platform, top quality AV content is one of the ways to do that. And that that platform differentiation has a knock-on effect into other electronic communication services as well. So what happens if we start to erode the territoriality? Let's consider first the pay TV and the home entertainment and VOD services, the services that consumers are paying for. Consumers are going to be incentivized in the short run to switch to international services. We find that uncontroversial. The one thing I would comment on from the numbers that you were presenting, your study is rightly capturing what I'd term market expansion. These are the people who would be incentivized to start purchasing this content if they had access to it. importantly for us, when we were thinking about the knock-on effects, was also this cannibalization effect. There's quite a large number of consumers who have access to work already, are already watching those works, but would quite happily switch to accessing that work at a lower price. When we looked at the Plum study, we found it wasn't really addressing that. It wasn't capturing those cannibalizing consumers. That is important, though. That can go in a couple of different directions. You could have high-income country consumers, so the UK, Germany, France, switch into potentially a slightly lower quality product, slightly delayed, but making the trade-off that the price of taking that from Poland or Bulgaria is worthwhile. If that work is subtitled in English, maybe they can turn the subtitles off. Equally, you can get consumers from those lower income countries where the work is perhaps a bit delayed and maybe offered dubbed, switching into higher priced but higher quality streams coming out of the UK or Germany, typically using an OTT service to do that. That might be if they have a preference for original language or if they just want to get these things as soon as they come out. Those sound like they should both be positives, but it has an important knock-on effect on, firstly, exclusivity. With that loss of exclusivity, you lose a premium on the price that platforms are willing to pay for the content that they are buying to show to their consumers. And that's not offset in our findings by the shifting around of consumers' demand from one place to another. It also has an important effect downstream at that platform level, at that distributor level. If I'm in a lower income country as a platform and I see my most able to pay consumers starting to migrate to a cross-border service, I'm losing an important part of my consumer base and I'm losing revenue that I would be investing in localized services. I think this is one of those areas that we very much focus on the consumer story. It's something came up this morning, I think, Augustine, you said it. It was about the services are just as important, and for us, the localization of AV services is really important, bringing that cultural saliency around a piece, marketing it properly, and voicing over, dubbing over. As the market evolves, we'd expect the retail prices to start to fall through competition, bringing more pressure on the platforms and their ability to pay for work, impacting on the revenue streams like that go to producers, like output deals or co-production deals. And of course, we've also got this cannibalization of other windows. So as well as having within window cannibalization, that's to say pay TV subscribers in the UK switching to pay TV in another country, you've also got a trade-off to be made. I know that I can get access to pay TV in 1 or 2 months' time from France, so I'm not going to go to the theatre now. So you're getting a trading down of the revenues that are being paid into production. Very briefly, on free-to-air TV, FTA TV, we see a similar set of mechanisms. The revenue flow is slightly different. We'd expect consumers to be, in some of the lower-income countries, potentially to switch to catch-up services, which are showing the premium drama or kids' TV or something at the time that it's released. So you're getting that quicker access to the material. But again, the platforms in the domestic home territories lose that content exclusivity that they were using to promote their platform, and they're losing the advertising revenues. It's worth remembering that the advertising, the eyeballs that are shifting to a foreign platform aren't worth as much to an advertiser. Advertising is a very national service. Advertising campaigns tend to be run on a national basis, even for international brands. The only ones that advertise internationally are those you find in an airport, so it's about 5 of them. All in all, this means that you're going to get lower content spend, which is going to have the short run or the medium run effects that we are reporting. We find that taking the consumer effect, which is largely beneficial, as we've seen, and weighing that against the output effect, which is this loss in output and associated loss in consumer welfare. Remember that. We buy movies because we enjoy watching them. The loss that we have amounts to about 9 billion, taking the number on the far right there, for consumers. That's as a result of the 8 billion loss in producer revenues and a drop in output of between 40 to 50%, depending on the specific type of work that you're looking for. Finally then, I'm probably pushing my time limits, but we wanted to think a little bit beyond that. That's a short run. That's if we don't allow, or rather we assume that producers don't take any evasive steps to prevent that harm to them. Now, if you're looking at an 8 billion loss, you're probably going to try and find ways to limit the harm. A few of the things that we thought about were pan-European licensing. I think there's a natural tendency to think about that as a commercial option. We will only license a single pan-European platform to show this work. Similarly, we talk about a wholesale variable pricing model where platforms are charged based on eyeballs. There's also other platform distribution restrictions that you could think about. For example, preventing platforms from putting this work on their catch-up service or from or from selling these works to an OTT service. And finally, there's the linguistic encoding of enforcing dubbing, making it so that this is only relevant to the country that it is intended for. However, I've seen evidence that says plenty of people would prefer to watch the original language rather than have the lip sync all out. Sadly, I'm not fluent enough to know myself. In all of these cases, I think the consumer is still getting a fairly raw deal. In the case of pan-European licensing or variable pricing, we're preventing consumers from accessing the works that they currently access at the price they access it. You're going to see a more pan-European price. That's going to put prices up for lower income countries whilst allowing prices to fall for those who've got the highest willingness to pay. When you think about the other sort of options we're looking at, we've got a decrease in quality. We're suppressing innovation if people and OTTs are being slowed down in their development. I think with the rise of Netflix just shows how much consumers want that sort of service. And enforcing dubbing where people would prefer an original version is undoubtedly a bad thing. Finally then, on this slide, I did just want to point out that we also find a distributional impact, something I think we touched on a bit earlier today as well. The impacts that we find are most pronounced in the lower income countries. These are the countries which are going to suffer most in our modelling from local platforms seeing their consumer base shift towards pan-European, international content-focused platforms, with the resultant loss in A, timely access to content that they can afford, and B, locally produced, locally targeted content.
Thanks so much. It is always nice to present some numbers of potential impact of something. One question that I have is, so the study was not referring to piracy, but motivated by Marine's comment this morning that motivation for their business was that there was a lot of piracy in music. From your knowledge on this industry, do you see an interaction between piracy and geo-blocking? I'm geo-blocked from something, so I will try to have access using illegal channels?
Overarching comment that we've heard a few times today, I think it's prevalent throughout these sort of work, is it's very difficult to get data on piracy. People tend not to admit crimes. That said, I think taking it from a theoretical perspective, there's two reasons for piracy. One is this access point. If I can't get access to something, I'm more likely to think of a pirate or potentially a grey, sort of a VPN or a foreign set-top box to gain access to the work that I want. I think our sense is that actually we've currently got quite good access. Most work is available to most people at a price they can afford. We saw some statistics this morning that I actually hadn't seen before about the range of that access, which I think was very promising. I think the other motivation for piracy is price, and it's really difficult to compete with free. So if you are price motivated, I think all the access in the world is not going to reduce piracy.
And allow me a second question that goes to methodology. So how did you measure the geo-blocking prohibition and restrictions on geo-blocking prohibitions in the study? It was that I'm in one country and suddenly I'm allowed to buy a subscription from another country for a film. So,
absolutely. We considered a few different modes. So we were largely focused around TV. I think that's where the question started. But we do expand into other channels as well. So within TV, it could be that you are considering taking a pay TV subscription from abroad. I think that's a relatively unlikely scenario. We think that the over-the-top, the VOD offerings are more likely. A subscription service like a Netflix, for example, from a foreign country might be appealing to consumers. Again, you've got this subscription basis. There's going to be a lot of stuff in there that maybe you're not so interested in. By the time you're getting down to TVOD, I think these are, and catch-up, free catch-up, these are where we see a lot of potential for that type of switching. And yeah, you're correct. That's how we were thinking about it. Consumers have that access. That's in our first part of our study. And then in the longer run, we start to think about how those accesses may be shut off with other commercial means and the impact that would then have on the consumer.
okay, thank you. So, Augustin, you represent consumer organizations. We see in the study that the loss for consumers because lower content will be produced will be very high. Do you agree with this?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, I apologize to those that were here before in the morning and they have to listen to me twice. Now on the on the discussion around geo-blocking in the audiovisual sector is of a different nature compared to the discussion that we had in the morning to other type of copyrighted content due to the complexities around pre-financing, territorial licensing, and stated. So there are different elements that come into play here. But what is undeniable is that consumers suffer geo-blocking the most in the audiovisual sector. And the main reason for that is territorial licensing, as we have seen in the evidence provided by the European Commission in the e-commerce sector inquiry, with 60% of the content being licensed only in one member state. So now the issue stake is why first this is bad for consumers. Of course, lack of availability is one of the reasons, and it's also linked to the remarks of Gareth at the beginning, and the link to piracy. And there, for example, interesting study from the EU IPO, the Intellectual Property Office for the European Union. There is an observatory that produced several studies, and they have the IP. They call it the IP scoreboard, in which they look, what are the reasons that people will turn into piracy, and lack of availability is one of them. So there could be a link, there could be a bridge between this geo-blocking and the piracy. In the case of pricing, you can see that people are also willing to pay for content. Sometimes they simply cannot. Of course, free, it's always there. It's very, very difficult to compete with free. But if you offer to consumer a better and easier solution than downloading from unauthorized sources, they will go for it. They did it with Spotify. They're doing it with Netflix and all these type of services, which are much more convenient. The second aspect, which could be addressed, and it's very important for this debate, why it's bad for consumers geo-blocking, is lack of competition, lack of competition per se. What will happen if you have a consumer consumers in one member state which are really unhappy with the offers that they have locally of the pay TV services, for example? Today, they don't even have the choice to subscribe to another provider in another member state, especially taking into account that this amounts to accessing content which is tailored for a different audience. And the tailoring of content is extremely important. We want to keep that, and it's important that consumers are able to access content that is tailored for taste reasons, cultural reasons, linguistic reasons, to their own audiences. But this shouldn't prevent the possibility for those consumers that would like to access the content, like the locals would do in those member states, to do so. And you made a remark of one of the risks or the fears of the industries is losing those revenues if you get consumers migrating to another member state, which It's very difficult, as I say, to anticipate, what would be the reaction of consumers. Most likely, there wouldn't be a massive migration because of the preference for the local context. But even if there is a certain level of migration or switching to service providers in another member state, I don't think that this is a bad thing. On the contrary, this would put pressure on those providers locally and not addressing the expectations of consumers in that country to improve their services in order to prevent that they decided to go to a provider, in this case, in another member state. Then, on the question of the switching, for example, to international services, this is something that is already happening. But again, if we want consumers to give a better choice, that the international services, at least having the opportunity to subscribe if they want to a provider in another member state will help to address this potential demand for cross-border services. Our members, they do market research and they check where there is interest. Of course, this varies from country to country, but we can say that there is an interest for consumers to access content that is primarily not available in their own countries. But then I like your initial remark is how we get there, how we enable the access while reducing the and justify our necessary disruptive risks for the industry. Here we have two scenarios. So we continue with the status quo, or in the other extreme, we have a pan-European licensing model in which everything is available to everybody at the same time, which might entail, as you say, some risks. That's why it's better to go on a step-by-step approach, and focusing, for example, in cross-border access, first in relation to pay TV services, for example, and this is what is being discussed in the context of the cross-border pay TV case, and see how this evolved to extend it to other types of services like video-on-demand platforms. What is also important is the ongoing reform of copyright. There is a specific proposal on the table related to the clearance of rights for broadcasting organizations, which is, again, it's one piece of the jigsaw, and it should help to facilitate this clearance of rights, which is a very important element and one of the reasons that, especially for public broadcasters, it's very difficult for them to grant access to consumers in another member state. Now, in relation to the impact on the pre-financing, which was your question, or to put it the other way around, is that will consumers stop watching content that is tailored for their own tastes? A French consumer will stop watching French films or French local productions because they will have the possibility to access abroad, and therefore this might affect the financing of those movies. It's very difficult to anticipate how consumers will react to these possibilities, but there will be, of course, a tendency that they will prefer to watch their local content, and the fact that they will want to watch a French movie does not prevent the fact that eventually they might want to access a German movie because by chance they speak German, or they would like to subscribe to a provider in another member states. So I don't necessarily agree with the idea that it will be extremely disruptive. It will be disruptive because the companies will have to change certain licensing practices to take into account, for example, the intended audience or different aspects. So, of course, this doesn't come without any type of consequences. But I will tend to disagree with the scenario that they usually describe, that is going to be the end of cultural diversity in Europe. Thank you.
Thank you very much. One question before I go to Werner. So you mentioned at some points of your talk that it is very difficult to predict and assess what will happen. So there is uncertainty. For example, in the pre-financing, what the consumers, how they will behave. Is this uncertainty a reason for waiting to get some further studies, some more information, instead of continue discussing this topic and try to do something right now?
Not really. This has been specifically on the issue of absolute territorial licensing. It's been discussed quite a lot, for example, in the context of the cross-border pay TV case. BEUC is an intervening party of the case, so I cannot give many details about the internal debates, but there have been very intensive discussions. Different parties having heard with different arguments. So no, I wouldn't say that there's a need to wait. Like for any legislation, you cannot have 100% certainty about what is going to happen in the future. Of course, with different economic studies, research, you can have a certain idea. Consumer behavioral insights can also help. But with the evidence that it's available, at least in the context of this case, I wouldn't say that the effect is going to be negative on consumers that will justify the maintenance of such practices.
Do you have any estimate of the potential positive impact?
There will be clearly more choice. Consumers will have the freedom to decide to which service provider subscribe in the EU. The impact in relation to piracy could be relevant as well if there is more choice. Those consumers that today cannot find their desired content in the first place, they might stop trying to download it from unauthorized sources. So, of course, there could be many positive outcomes for consumers, especially on the choice argument. I think that's very important.
But you don't have any number?
No, I don't have numbers.
Okay. Werner, thanks for coming. You are very active in the geo blocking discussion, not so much on audiovisual. And thank you for accepting also to be on this part of the discussion active. I will start with a question, and of course you can talk and develop your thoughts. Is that we see that the Commission was very active with physical goods, non-copyrighted services with a proposal. Then we had a lot of discussion about non-audiovisual services. In audiovisual sector, we don't see so much discussion from the side of the Commission. Is this something that you don't consider as an issue, geo-blocking in audiovisual? You want to leave it as it is? You discuss it internally?
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. And again, my apologies for being late, but until 1, we discussed non-audiovisual in the Council. So it's very close to the topic here. And if I'm running off afterwards, I'm not being impolite or avoiding small talk, but we are resuming at 2:15, actually. I will be late anyway. Of course, we're discussing all of this. I mean, one of you said step by step. Yeah? I mean, this is clearly what probably characterizes also the geo-blocking proposal, to start from this one best. Yeah? And we were, from the outset, trying to, as always, strike a balance between various interests. And there's never the win-win-win situations out there, because I've been here for 21 years and been involved in many proposals and initiatives. There's not been one where everybody would shout, hooray, everybody's going to win. Yeah? It doesn't happen. So you have to be a bit prudent and start with the things where you're reasonably sure that the benefits outweigh the costs. Yeah? You said, of course, 100% certainty will never be there. I've never seen an impact assessment that was 100% correct. Can't be. Yeah? But still, you try to start with the areas where you are reasonably confident that the benefits outweigh the costs. Yeah? That was the starting point with the goods part of the proposal, or the locally consumed services other than copyright-protected ones. Because even their industry largely disagrees with us, yeah, and says, well, you are claiming there's no extra cost and risk for us, or only marginal ones, but that's not true. But we felt confident here we have a strong case. On non-audiovisual, already in our proposal, we took the next step, if you want, because contrary to audiovisual, we did include it in the scope of the proposal. We then, in Article 4, carved out, of course, the main provision, but still it's in the scope. It's covered by Article 3, no blocking of websites. It's covered by Article 5. But then we said, okay, Article 4, not yet, in a way. That's what we said. Yeah, we said, well, let's look at it in the review clause, but there's a clear political indication, in a way, that is not a red line, let's not discuss non-audiovisual. So the negotiations now will be very much around this. Yeah? Should it be an outright no, or should it be a later? You know, that we'll have to see. On audiovisual, of course, there are discussions in the Commission as there are discussions outside. And when you heard the Vice President Ansip at the very beginning of his mandate, when he said, I hate geo-blocking, I'm quite sure he had more things in mind than that actually found its way into the draft regulation. Yeah, it's quite obvious. I mean, it's what matters to people. People are concerned by this. And I think all of your studies confirm, of course, that there is interest and demand for access also to audiovisual in the first place. And we don't deny that at all. But of course, as also the Oxera study showed, and you indeed acknowledged in your own study, it's very complex. Yeah, it's very complicated. And there are lots of risks and health warnings, which we're taking as seriously as you do, which led us to conclude at this point in time, it's not in our proposal. Now, there is a review clause. Again, it will be in the negotiations what the review clause will actually entail. But if you ask me, a review clause is a review clause. Whatever we put in there now, you're always free to examine options. Yeah? And therefore, quite naturally, in a couple of years' time, one would go back and say, well, have things changed in the meantime? We are talking about a very vibrant environment here. Yeah? Business models emerge and disappear and change and so on. I'm working on all digital matters, as you know, including platforms and so on. It's very, very hard to predict what the world will look like in 5 years from now. Yeah? So quite naturally, as time moves on, will we be interested in looking into changing markets, changing consumer expectations? But at the end of the day, what are we always trying to do? On the one hand, as a commission, we are trying to strike the right balance ourselves. That's why when we do a proposal. Yeah? There's the consumer, and then there's the industry. In the case of audiovisual, it's a bit more complicated than in other areas, because it's not just consumer versus, in inverted commas, business, and whom do you benefit more than the other, probably. But as we just heard, there are repercussions even on the consumer. If you do it wrong, then this may even lead to consumer detriment at the end of the day. Neither you nor I have the figures now, you know, who may lose and how much. And you can also then distinguish between the headline figure, you know, aggregated, we will all be happy or dead or what have you. But even more interesting is the distributional impacts that you also mentioned very rightly. Yeah? And that's again, let's assume we have perfect figures out there, and we were able to predict consumer and business behavior, which is a no-go anyway. But even if we were, you would then probably see, all right, there are distributional effects that in some, let's say, low-income member states, consumers may be worse off, but many others would win. Now, again, would we just add up the figures now? Or would we come with a political judgment and say, well, even though overall consumers may win, although some suggestions are that they may not, yeah, but are we sacrificing some consumers for others? You know, it's not a value statement at this point in time, but it's the sort of questions that we have to ask ourselves, and the answer is always difficult to give. But then comes our second reality, and that's the political reality. Because whatever researchers, economists, and so on may think about the likely effects, we then face Parliament and Council. And in this area in particular, as you all know, there's hardly any area which is so hotly debated as the copyright world, the cultural world, cultural diversity. It's sometimes bordering religion. It's clearly it's clearly something which goes beyond pure economics. Yeah, and as I said, I just come from the non-audiovisual debate, and I heard some very strong language. Yeah. So once again, yeah, economics and evidence is fine and absolutely needed, but then there's the political world. The link between the two is, however, there as well, because if you help us to identify segments, areas, targeted approaches that can be isolated probably, and which are less risky than others, even in this area, a step-by-step may be realistic at some point in time. Because what are member states saying to me is, well, you don't have an impact assessment that proves that, you know, the benefits outweigh the costs, yeah? So you could also turn this around and say, well, now we have some very targeted research that says if you do it intelligently here and there and like this, you know, probably that can also shift the political debate at some point in time.
Thank you very much. It's always important to keep in mind that it is not only an economic issue, but also political. And in the end, it will need a political consensus to move forward. I'm sure there will be some reactions to what was said. Who wants to? Scott, do you want to comment on what the panelists said?
I think everything was clear. I actually heard less disagreement among the panelists than I might have expected. I think there was a fair degree of agreement on points. Actually, one question I would raise, then coming back to my comments, in the last couple of slides I tossed out a couple of ideas about things that might be a little less intrusive and that seem very much to be along the lines of what Werner was talking about, either suggesting that if there were a restriction that came into play somewhat later in the windowing system so that it put less revenue at risk, or alternatively a restriction that dealt only with transactional video on demand rather than subscription. There are probably people both on the panel and in the audience that can judge that better than I can, but I'd be curious what people think as to the viability of ideas like that.
Gareth, do you think that this could be a way to alleviate the concerns for financing and the risks for creating less content?
Let me take them separately. So first of all, the late in the game argument, the window argument. I think there's three things that I would caution. I think it's an interesting suggestion, definitely. I think it needs really careful examination, and it's not a silver bullet. First of all, we have to consider the fact that you showed us that lovely windowing graph where you can see where the overlaps occur.
It's your windowing graph.
Good point. So you can see where the overlaps occur. That graph was obviously averages, and averages do mask the individual. And I think you'll find that although those may be coming out in average, that doesn't preclude the fact that individual works could actually be looking considerably differently across countries, opening up that cross-window arbitrage that we've talked about. I think as well, you have to remember that consumers make an inherent trade-off every time they select which window they want to watch a movie. And I know that, I don't get as much chance to go to the cinema as I used to with a young family. I only make time for it when it's a really, a top film. I have to. The rest of the time, I think, okay, I'm gonna wait for that one to come out on pay TV. If you've got that option across borders and you've changed the timescales that I have to wait for that, I'm weighing up my price, my availability, my other circumstances a bit differently. I'm now weighing them up, perhaps more in favour of a lower income stream. So we're still seeing that erosion. And finally, a feature we didn't really touch on actually in any of the presentations is how this content is actually delivered. AV content is characterized by content bundling. You very rarely purchase, possible exception of TVOD, we can come on to, a individual work. You tend to purchase a bundle of work, which is in the form of a channel, in the form of an SVOD subscription. So there's some real technical, practical questions to be raised about how you would implement a time-limited solution. It would probably have to be an old films channel or something. I don't quite see how that would work, and what the appeal, would it still retain its appeal if that practical solution was found, because simply having gaps in your TV schedule seems unworkable. On the TVOD question, again, thinking about this in the framework of the second half of our report, how would industry respond? I think at the moment TVOD has quite a favourable positioning in the windowing schedule. It's quite up there shortly after theatrical, typically before pay TV in the home entertainment window. And that's a great way. It's a great innovative way of people being able to get content. I love being able to sit on my TV and just go straight to the things. It's easy and useful. if producers know that that is the medium that's going to get used to cannibalize their other revenues, I fear that we're incentivizing them to withhold those rights and push it further down the window with a stifling effect on that service development. And like you've said, the way people access these works and innovations in that sphere, in that service layer, rather than just the work layer, is just as important to the overall enjoyment of these. And stifling that would be a shame, I think.
Any reaction from this side?
Yes, on the two suggestions. The problem with the window is that, of course, consumers will not necessarily like to wait. If you go online to the website and the movie is there, you want to watch it, you cannot buy it, because you have to wait 2 months and 3 days to be able to do it. It doesn't really address the core of the problem.
Time-dependent value, eh?
Exactly. Of course, this is how the exploitation is being organized. Sometimes you get a movie in a cinema, and in one country, and 3 weeks later in another country, and it's how it's organized, the distribution of the films in each territory. But then when it started becoming available online, particularly on-demand platforms, is where consumers suffer or feel the effects of geoblocking the most. Now, on the transactional video on demand, the one purchase approach, I think it's an interesting suggestion, perhaps to try or test. Still, it won't solve the problem of a consumer who would like to subscribe to a video on demand platform that is available in another member state because the catalog is more interesting. I would love to be able to subscribe to HBO Spain and cannot do it. And this solution will not necessarily address this type of demands. But still, there are interesting things to consider.
Fair enough. Actually, my thought really was to try to toss out some ideas of where there might be knobs that could be fiddled, so that in the kind of process that Werner was putting forward, that one could perhaps start at a relatively modest threshold and see what happens, but in a way that isn't likely to completely break the system. This is very interesting feedback. I appreciate it.
Yeah. And the logic was more on state-by-state approach, since we cannot arrive to then directly to somehow improve incrementally the situation. So let's open the floor for questions. Please come forward. I see. Please identify yourself.
I'm Paula Nebbia from Sherman & Sterling. Can you hear? Yeah? Okay. Well, I work a little bit on the industry, as some of you know, but I'll restrain myself to 2 points. One actually very much has to do with what you suggested on TVOD and SVOD. And if the concern is that cross-border access may erode territoriality, then I think for TVOD, that could potentially also be an important risk, because as compared to subscription, and as Augustin said, for subscription you get an entire bundle of content which is culturally targeted. For TVOD, if you're just looking for something cheaper, then you buy a la carte, then you just go to another provider in another country. So I think that's something to give some thoughts about. Second point to Gareth, I noticed that when you discussed piracy, you put in the same pot piracy and VPN and grey market. That's not quite the same, because customers for VPN and grey market are willing to pay. They just don't have access. Pirates, are not necessarily also willing to pay. Thanks.
There is a question back. Let's collect some questions, and you can comment, or comments, and you can comment on that collectively.
Miguel Riozola from Clifford Chance. Just a question on the figures you gave before. You said that cross-border trade was like 370 million at the beginning, which didn't seem like a lot, actually. And then we also heard the number, the 8.2 billion losses in revenues. Maybe you could put this into context. It'll be interesting. Thanks.
Other questions? So, reactions by the panelists. Please, Scott.
Well, let's see, as far as the point on transaction-based, I guess the only point I'd make is that if the largest reason why people want to purchase cross-border is that they can't find things in their member state, it might be that the willingness to purchase individual titles is a little higher than it would be for a normal subscription. It's a thought. Again, this is a largely untried experiment, but it's a thought. As far as the relative magnitude of the numbers, they're really talking about very different things. That 378 million, I agree, it's not a very big number. Now, there's enormous uncertainty in that number, but it's still not a very big number. It's simply looking at how much unmet demand might be out there. The 8.2 billion is the number from the Oxera study in the case where there's been no reaction from the industry to the rules. And so, and that's the producer loss. The consumer loss is of the same order of magnitude. So, and they're additive, they're both bad, right? So, so for that reason, I think to your point, if you say how much do we gain, how much do we lose in sort of the raw economic terms, it looks like a pretty bad deal. This is the reason why in our study we said, hey, this really needs a note of caution. Yeah. And that's, I mean, and on this, even though our studies for the Parliament, Oxera's was for the industry, but we reached largely similar conclusions on this. It's, let's wait a minute here.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that. I'll take them in reverse order just to carry on with what you're saying. One other thing to bear in mind with the 8.2 billion versus 0.3 billion is Scott's report very correctly identified the extra consumption that was on the table. He was saying this is what people are not able to do at the moment that they would like to do. And we agree that that's out there. What we're also saying is that there is a cannibalization effect, which your study wasn't trying to get at and didn't. That cannibalization effect is large, and that's where people are already purchasing and would switch to purchase elsewhere. When you add into that the additional layer, which is the platform distributor layer, they are the people who pay producers, not consumers, generally. So their incentives to, or their willingness and ability to pay for content decreases not just in the number of eyeballs, but also in factors like exclusivity that they have and the ability to use that work to differentiate themselves. So the effect of consumers moving around is magnified as soon as I lose that exclusivity premium that's being paid to producers. So that's where the 8.2 billion comes from, why it's of such an order of magnitude different. The cannibalization, the magnification due to exclusivity loss, and the fact you've got this separate layer in between, which is the platform.
I should actually add that I don't really see the studies as being in conflict necessarily. No. Our study quoted theirs and said, but you have to watch out for this. Yeah,
agreed. That also speaks to the point a lady from Sherman Sterling was making about piracy and VPN/grey markets. I think something worth remembering, you're right, I blurred them a little bit incorrectly. Piracy can be taken as I am getting an illegal copy of a work from, BearShare or something, if that still exists. Then you've got the VPN grey market, where, remember, if I'm accessing Netflix from abroad using a VPN, not only am I paying for my Netflix subscription in my home country, I'm also paying for my VPN subscription, more than likely, because the free ones, I'm told, aren't of enough quality. So you are right, there is a willingness to pay, but we need to avoid double counting. They are already paying into the system, and they're then using this to transfer their source of costs.
Thank you. Any comments from this side? Or let's see, are there any other questions? Yeah, please. 1 minute for the microphone.
I'm interested on the impact of Ted Shapiro from Wigan, on the impact between, say, international or American content and national content. Mm-hmm. With respect to piracy, mm-hmm. If you look on the Pirate Bay and you see the top 10 movies that are being pirated, they will be 10 American blockbusters. Yes. Usually, it varies. So if people are pirating those movies are available in every member state already, legally, illegally. So I don't see how piracy could be a factor. So I'm wondering, is it piracy to get to, for a Finnish guy who wants to see a Spanish movie but can't? Is that the piracy that's going on? Because the real piracy that I see on the internet is around mostly not all of it, but mostly blockbusters. Coming back to this point in the Oxera study where you say, well, ultimately, there's going to be a hit on local content. If the Maltese platform, that is probably the only entity in Malta, apart from the government, that funds Maltese content, is no longer able to buy international content at the prices that it will cost, and therefore no longer have exclusivity and no longer able to attract lots of Maltese subscribers, well, ultimately he goes out of business. So then there is no private sector funder of Maltese content. Only the government is left. So is the impact going to be much more pronounced on European content than the 6 dancing gorillas in Hollywood, who will keep on making this stuff and have been treating Europe as a single market for years whenever they had to? And so how much are you looking at those differences between international, read American, although there are some others, and European content, both in those contexts of commerce and piracy?
Thank you.
Yeah,
Please,
I
Gareth.
can tell. In terms of piracy, as I said, we've not looked in depth at the piracy question, so I've not got data to draw on. But I think the piracy of international work has an effect on local content for the same reason that across border access would. As you sort of allude to, if you've got a small local platform who is making investments in local content, their attractiveness, their revenue stream comes from this content bundle, as we talked about earlier. You know, content's not generally sold in these individual parcels. It's sold as a platform. I'm selling a movie channel which includes a combination of both international work and some local work. What's more, movie studios who are operating locally have what's called an output deal. This is a deal to say we will supply 25 films into this channel at a pre-arranged price per film, typically then with bonuses paid based on box office success to uplift the price for the more successful titles. Those provide a channel for local producers of a local work to partner with the US institutions and get their films funded, knowing that they've got a route to market, knowing that they've got this certainty of revenue that allows them to bridge their financing. So even local film producers are dependent upon the mechanisms that are set up in this industry to get their work financed. I think if we do see a move towards a pan-European market for these things, we should expect more focus on works of international appeal. We should probably expect a slimming down of the number of operators in the market. A point Augustine made earlier was that you're looking for more choice, and I guess the thing that comes to my mind, is it more choice or is it just different choice? If I'm a Polish producer at the moment, I'm not happy with my local pay TV operator, Polish consumer, sorry, I'm not happy with my local pay TV operator, and I start shopping abroad, over time we can expect that operator to suffer to potentially the point of going out of business or becoming a less established platform, at which point my choice has changed. I'm now looking over a span of European providers rather than local providers, but not necessarily getting the breadth of choice that you might expect for that.
Yeah, but wouldn't that Polish provider, in order not to disappear, improve their own services in order to retain the customers?
The question is whether they can, though, because if the Polish platform relies on exclusivity from buying international content in order to attract local subscribers, in order to fund Polish content, and he's no longer being able to have access to that international content because it's too expensive for him now, or the suppliers of that content have decided to just fund the big international player, or just supply the big international players, it comes to a question about not the willingness of the Polish platform to make better services, whether he'll be able to. And the Maltese one, I picked Malta for a reason, because of course in Malta, the content is in English. So
Yes.
Coming back to this point that Auxerre was talking about, what will people do when the hammer comes down in order to alleviate the pain a little? Well, one of the things they might do is stop selling content in English to places like Malta. I wondered in the previous session why Spotify would keep on operating in Bulgaria. Why the Bulgarians can sign up to Spotify somewhere else. Why waste the money in Bulgaria after the change?
I'd put a nuance on that. I don't think they would stop selling content to Malta in English. They would stop selling content to Malta in English cheaper.
Well, yeah, that's what I meant. It will be too expensive. If they want to pay...
You have to buy the price for all European exploitation
That's based on the
rights.
assumption that it will be a massive migration of consumers going towards these international platforms, which is not necessarily the case, because consumers will always prefer to buy their own tailored content. So,
and all I'm asking about is whether or not the Maltese platform in question will be able to continue doing that.
hopefully yes.
Hopefully yes.
I cannot say that, but if they offer, what is clear that if they offer something that is good for their customers...
They won't multi to the Maltese operator if the Maltese operator has to charge more money because he's paying more money for content. For the reasons that we mentioned before, that the content prices are going to go up in most places, lower in some, but above what it was in Malta before. I'm basing myself on what I heard from the study.
If you're in a typical price differentiation scenario, you would have a producer that's able to differentiate between different, ideally individuals, first degree, but let's take groups, third degree, of people who are able to pay differently. I can expand the number of people that I'm offering my service to without sacrificing all of the revenue that I'd be earning on those who are able to pay most. And we see this all around us all the time. Somebody mentioned, I think you mentioned students earlier. We see this, that is the rationale for offering student discounts, is I would not get students into my theatre or into my restaurant if I didn't offer a discount. I'm expanding the number of people I can serve whilst not losing the revenues that I would have earned on the mass of people who can pay more, allow me to recover the amounts that I need to invest in the product or service I'm offering in the first place.
Yeah, and in fact, this was actually a discussion also from the first panel. The question is, with this sort of national differentiation of prices based on willingness to pay in the different countries,
Yes.
I think if one starts from a European federalist kind of view, one says, oh, this is awful, it should be the same price everywhere. From an economic perspective, one would argue that Ramsey boîtier pricing, which basically means that you price according to the relative price elasticity of demand. I mean, Ramsey did that as an optimal theory of taxation. This is not supposed to be harmful to public welfare. It's supposed to be optimal for public welfare. So one can make a credible argument.
So the point is that if there is cross-border access, as a result, the Maltese operator will be charged more for acquiring content.
That's my hypothesis. And the reason being is because that Maltese operator is now not restricted only to supply in the Maltese audience. Think of it this way, they have to buy, if I'm selling the rights and I know that you can service any English-speaking consumer.
With Maltese content, international and Maltese, because we're talking about bundles.
Yes.
So
Correct.
probably there's like other stuff that are totally Maltese, which British audience would be interested
And
in.
for those works, they probably we wouldn't expect the... for those works on the first order, we wouldn't expect the price to change. However, those works typically depend upon, typically might be too strong, those works can depend upon using the mechanisms that are set up that include international work, like, for example, these output deals, in order to generate the certainty of revenue that they need to greenlight the work in the first place. So I'm still producing a work which is of high value. I need a lot of capital to start the work. The way I can get that through my greenlighting committee is to say, we know that we're going to put it onto the film channel on Go TV as part of the deal that one of the Hollywood majors has, because we've partnered with them to get that distribution deal. if that output deal has been put in jeopardy because that output deal now requires such high prices that the Maltese operator is unable to justify or pay for that, then they are going to find that's unavailable to them. Just to take it one complicated step further, it is also conceivable that a country like Malta says, do you know what, we can service the English-speaking market at a lower price. We're going to do that. In order to keep attracting consumers, we're just going to start focusing on international content. That's what sells abroad, not Maltese content. So once again, the Maltese consumers are facing a degradation of their local service as a result of the
Which was your question?
increase.
We are talking about a different service then. I mean, a service which is tailored for an international audience, which is meant to be for an international audience, rather than meant to preserve the cultural diversity of Malta.
Well,
Sorry.
What we're saying is at the moment, this platform, this fictional Maltese platform, has a mix of content that is both Maltese and international. It is tailored, and we're saying that maybe they won't be able to fund as much Maltese. Well, we don't know for sure, but that's what it looked like the study said.
Yep.
They may not be able to fund as much Maltese content. The last point there was not only that, they may say, oh, cool, now we can serve all of Europe, but we can't get those other people in with this Maltese stuff, so let's just have the international crowd.
Sorry, if I can just step in.
Sorry. We are run out of time, but we are out. I see some more questions. So if the panelists are willing to extend for 5-10 minutes.
Happy to, yeah.
I think this is just getting interesting now.
Okay.
I agree.
We have 2 questions here and there.
Yeah, sorry if I can just follow up on that. I am Emilia Antonis. I represent commercial broadcasters. And what you've just been discussing is our main concern. Just to summarize it, we have content. So broadcasters, they typically mix content like news and entertainment, local fiction, and international fiction and sports. International fiction and sports generally have a very high return on investment. Because, of course, it's produced for more than one market. News and local fiction, we generally lose money on, big time. So we need the return on investment on those international hits to be able to invest in news, local entertainment, local fiction, because we often lose money there. So if we don't have access at all anymore to licenses on that kind of international content, because it might have moved to a pan-European licensing basis because of the changes, or at a price that is too high, we will no longer be able to invest in news and in local fiction.
Okay. Clear through these cross-subsidies. Please.
Thank you very much. I'm Vita Yukniam from DG Connect of the European Commission. Listening this debate, and especially this fiction about Maltese package suddenly becoming pan-European or the other way around, I have one question because Garrett, you mentioned and underlined about specificity of audiovisual sector, that demand is very fragmented, diversified and country specific. So this is a very important feature in the stand of the market. In that context, for me, I just don't follow fully how can one sort of forecast the future of the European audiovisual market, where we have only universal, nivellated demands, only grasping international content, just in order to be able to offer some cheaper whatever offers to consumers. Because I think what consumers want, especially when they buy subscription, is a package of content. And you mentioned that tastes are different. What attracts Spanish consumers may not attract British or German consumers. So in that context, I still don't follow how, say, like a bit removing some geo-blocking elements from European market could somehow change this landscape so that all consumers would somehow be only looking for offers with international blockbusters and sports, forgetting the rest. And also, like just in this context, to mention that there are already packages of services like subscription VOD services which focus on these elements. So consumers have that already, and they still subscribe in addition to their local TV programs or other local packages. So in that context, perhaps you could clarify why do you see this big danger about this small business out? Thank you.
So I think for me, to paraphrase the point you're making, what I hear is consumers do want a localized package. They do want to have a mix of international and local works. And we don't understand why we're going to suddenly see a complete switching over to international services if that were available. I think there's a step missing in the logic, and it's all around the investment case that we've been talking about previously. So economics works in the margins. Economics works not on the average, it works on the fringes. And as we start to enable geo-blocking, we're going to see that fringe of consumers, the most able consumers. I'm going to talk from, let's say, a lower income or lower willingness to pay perspective right now, because they're the ones that we saw at the end of the presentation are the most likely to get a negative impact from this. You're going to see that upper band of willing and able consumers start to say, do you know what, I don't want to wait to get the latest Hollywood blockbusters. I am just going to take an international subscription. Maybe both, maybe some start to turn off the local. We then start to see that pay TV, that local domestic pay TV revenue declining as a result of that. That's what we hypothesize. And during the study, I should say, we actually did tailor the modeling to account for things like penetration of broadband on the hypothesis that would be OTT services and catch-up services, which is the natural go-to for these. We looked at English language penetration, content on TV, stuff like that. So we have used what data is available to try and build a picture of how likely this is in different geography, or different geographic regions anyway. So as my pay TV platform starts to lose revenue as a result of people seeking these prime movies, and we know that, I think it's relatively uncontroversial to me anyway, that Prime movie is an attractive feature. I mean, in the UK, Ofcom went all the way to exploring this and asked the CC to look at whether Sky should be forced to sell movies on a wholesale must-offer basis. Now, they stopped short of it, but the fact that they have to ask the question shows that this is such an important part of how consumers select their retail package. The cream at the top has started switching, so my revenue is now declining. Out of my most profitable packages, I'm now left with less to invest in my local services. The first thing that goes is that prime expensive content. So I'm now narrowing my focus from being a well-rounded platform with a mixture of international and local. I'm now narrowing that down to less international, older international, and some local, and it starts a vicious cycle. My revenues go down further as people go abroad to seek that international work, giving me even less to invest locally. Add on top of that the compounding impact of the prices rising, the loss of exclusivity payments that are being paid to the producers because that content is now being competed from abroad, and we see a downward spiral. That's what our model started to reveal, this downward spiral. Though I do agree that on the face of it, you need that link, you need that investment link to be able to make the logic.
Thank you.
Can I just add something?
There were many.
Yeah, sorry, just very, very briefly. It's again, we're working on this assumption that consumers will subscribe to the local offers or the local packages just because of the international broadcasters, which again contradicts this idea that consumers prefer locally tailored content. So this demand for locally tailored content will remain. Therefore, if consumers will continue wanting to watch a Maltese movie, French movie, German movie, there is a demand that will have to be fulfilled. Therefore, it's hard for me to see how the fact that you might be able to subscribe to a foreign offer under the same conditions as these foreign customers, which is content that is not even tailored for the taste of these consumers, will undermine, at the end of the day, the choices of consumers that are buying locally in the same country.
Yes, please.
I can try to answer that. We don't know that you're wrong or that you're right for sure. But what we're hypothesizing is that, first of all, yes, consumers prefer local content. That's clear. The question is the capacity of local players to fund the creation of that local content, even with that demand for local content, will they be in a position to fund it? And part of the funding of that local content comes from the acquisition and showing in subscriptions, etc., of international content. It's the mix of the two that I think you were trying to describe. And that's what I think the hypothesis is saying. Not that, of course, people are going to still like local content after whatever legislative changes happen, whatever regulatory changes happen. The question will be the capacity of local players to continue to fund it when they may not have the same access to international content that funds local content. Mm-hmm. And funds it through various different mechanisms, not only the pre-sale of rights and things like that, but actually through taxing the international content to throw into the subsidy coffers.
Any other further thought of that? Any reaction? Any other question? Okay, so thanks a lot. Let's thank the speakers warmly for being here with us. I would like to thank you for being here and also for being active, participating in the discussion. This is the spirit we want to have. And thanks a lot for coming. Take care. Have a nice afternoon.
Thank you.